Good afternoon. I'm Mr. Bryan. I teach 11th grade U.S. History at Mary G. Montgomery High School. Today we're going to be looking at the Alabama State Standard for History students, number 15, and it says, describe changing social and cultural conditions in the United States during the 1950s, 1960s, and 1970s. So last week we talked about this standard and we looked at the 50s and the 60s. We specifically looked at the beginning of the Cold War. We looked at containment, the Korean conflict. We even talked about the fear of communism here in the United States and abroad. We even talked about, with abroad, we talked about the Cuban Missile Crisis. This week we're going to look at the fear of communism and our foreign policy specifically during the 60s and the 70s. So the second half of that timeline in that standard. So on the board I have our essential question and our objectives. Let's look there together. The essential question today is, how did the Vietnam War impact the lives of Americans? Our objectives, the first one, analyze the political, social, and cultural issues associated with the Vietnam War. And our second objective, trace the discontent that led to the social protest in the 1960s. Now, before we get started with this lesson, I'd like to remind you that by the end of the lesson, I'm going to ask you a question, and by answering that question correctly, you are eligible to win either a meal from Chick-fil-A or t-shirts, and there's an email address here on the screen. And again, I'm going to put all this back up at the end. So just keep that in mind. At the end of the lesson, I'm going to ask you a question about today's lesson. Okay? So to get started, let's talk about the Vietnam War, and let's talk about how it began, and specifically different things that fell into place to get us involved in Vietnam. And I'll say this before we ever get started, I'm going to reiterate it in a second, that there was no formal declaration of war. There was not an event that happens that has us just say we're going to war. It is a gradual series of steps that'll get us there. Okay, so looking at this slide, it'll kind of help us see where in the world we are and help me explain how things began. So in the bottom left, I give you a world map, and you can see that Vietnam is in Southeast Asia, just south of China. And on this larger map, this is a blown up version of this. You can see China here and Vietnam, both north and south. So to give you a brief history of what happened, all of this area of the world originally, before World War II, was colonized by the French. It's nicknamed French Indochina. And the Japanese during World War II invaded this entire area of the world. And if you'll remember back, their empire was called the Greater East Asian Co-Prosperity Sphere. It's a mouthful, but it just explains that the Japanese were expanding everywhere. Now, after World War II, this is where all of this gets interesting. The Japanese leave this area of the world. Well, Vietnam wants to become its own nation. And Ho Chi Minh is a man that is leading the country, pushing for independence. Well, at the same time, after World War II, the French want to come back in and have influence over this area of the world. So they invade, and a war begins between Ho Chi Minh and the Vietnamese and the French. The United States is involved in sending money and helping the French because we don't want to see Vietnam fall to communist rule. And Ho Chi Minh was a communist supporter and sympathizer. So we didn't want to see him rule, so we sent aid to the French. In the end of this war, because remember what we want to do, we want to contain communism, but in the end of this war, Ho Chi Minh is successful. There was a Geneva Accords that settled this, which divided Vietnam at the 17th parallel, leaving communism in the north and democracy in the south. And it wasn't long after this that Ho Chi Minh, in an attempt to try to take all of Vietnam for himself and have one united nation under his leadership, he begins attacking the South. His group that is fighting in the South is called the Viet Cong, and this is where the United States gets involved. There's a leader of South Vietnam that is a democratic leader named No Dien Diem. Now, we begin casting our support for No Dien Diem, and over time we're sending money and we're sending weapons and we're sending people, and just more and more and more we're sending resources to South Vietnam as they fight the aggression of North Vietnam. Over time, as President Johnson comes into office as President of the United States, you're going to see that a North Vietnamese ship fires on a U.S. ship. In that process, he declares the Tonkin Gulf Resolution, which allows U.S. ships to fire at will, and it also gives the U.S. president all necessary military powers. So he doesn't have to go before Congress. We can retaliate or do what we need to do in Vietnam in order to defend ourselves. We also initiate a military campaign called Operation Rolling Thunder, which is a long bombing campaign of Vietnam. And by 1965, we have over 50,000 U.S. troops on the ground in Vietnam. So again, with all of this, there's no declaration of war. There's just escalation over time. Americans look up and we're in the middle of fighting, and we have a draft, and we have people that are leaving and going overseas to fight in Vietnam. So again, it's just a gradual escalation of the war and no declaration of war. Now, there are many people that disagreed with the decision to fight, and that number will increase over time. It starts out lower, but it increases over time. People that oppose the war. But President Johnson felt that we needed to be involved, and he defended his reasoning, saying that for two reasons we need to be there. We need to contain communism. So remember how the Korean War was a war of containment. Vietnam War as well, that we're going to get involved and we're going to contain communism and keep it in the north, not allow it to spread to the south. And the second thing was that we're fulfilling a promise that we made to the South Vietnamese people, as we've sent aid over the years, helping them keep the communism in the north from spreading into the south. So these two documents on the board help explain that. Let's look at the first one. It says, why are we in Vietnam? So this is President Johnson speaking. He says, why are these realities our concern? Why are we in South Vietnam? We are there because we have a promise to keep. Since 1954, every American president has offered support to the people of South Vietnam. We have helped to build, we have helped to defend. Thus, over many years, we have made a national pledge to help South Vietnam defend its independence. And I intend to keep that promise. So we've been there, we've been helping them, and he says we're not going to abandon them, we have a promise to keep. If you look down at the bottom document, here's where he speaks on containment. He says, we will stay because in Asia and around the world are countries whose independence rests in large measure on confidence in America's word and in America's protection. To yield to force in Vietnam would weaken that confidence, would undermine the independence of many lands, and would whet the appetite of aggression. We would have to fight in one land, and then we would have to fight in another, or abandon much of Asia to the domination of communists. So again, this is the president saying that it is essential that we contain communism, and that is our ultimate goal, is containment as a foreign policy. Now, fighting in Vietnam, there were a few challenges that we had. The most important thing is the Ho Chi Minh Trail. This trail, and again, it's written here, the title, the Ho Chi Minh Trail. This trail, think of it as a major lifeline, an artery. And you know that if an artery or a major lifeline is severed, it's a serious problem. Well, if the United States could stop this Ho Chi Minh Trail, then we're going to be far more successful in the war, but we were never able to do that. This is a trail hidden in the jungles of Vietnam, and as you can see, it goes into neighboring countries as well. And it is a trail through which the Viet Cong, who we were fighting in the south, were receiving weapons, ammunition, resources. Now, don't think that this just begins and originates in North Vietnam. This is the Cold War. The Viet Cong were receiving resources through the Ho Chi Minh Trail from North Vietnam, which was receiving resources through the Ho Chi Minh Trail from China, which was receiving resources through the Ho Chi Minh Trail from the Soviet Union. So again, it's this steady stream of resources coming into the South, and the United States is fighting in the South to try to find that supply line and stop that supply line. Also, the Viet Cong are considered an elusive enemy. Elusive meaning very hard to find. They were hidden in the jungles of Vietnam. And Vietnam, as you can see in the bottom pictures, thick jungles. Very hard to find the enemy that we're fighting when they're hidden behind brush or underground or wherever. Very hard to find them. But also the Viet Cong were hidden in cities amongst the South Vietnamese people. And U.S. troops had trouble being able to figure out who was Viet Cong members and who was loyal to the United States. So there were three tactics that the United States used in Vietnam to try to find Viet Cong members. Number one was napalm. Number two, Agent Orange. And number three, search and destroy missions. So we'll start with napalm. It's the picture at the top right here, where you see a large explosion. Napalm is like an accelerant, like gasoline, something that when ignited will explode. So we were using that to destroy the jungles in Vietnam to be able to see and carry out operations and be able to visibly be able to see where our enemy was. Agent Orange, the top left, is a herbicide. It's a chemical which we would spray over jungles and destroy the trees and kill the trees so that we could see and find our enemy. Now the problem with this is destroying the forest and the jungles, but also it has a negative health impact on people. The civilians living in South Vietnam, as well as the U.S. troops. You would see cancers and issues, health issues that resulted after this in generations that were even at that time unborn. You see many U.S. veterans that have suffered because of the effects and the exposure to Agent Orange. Now, lastly, the third tactic to find Viet Cong members was search and destroy missions. U.S. troops would go into cities and invade the cities and do intense questioning of civilians and try to determine who was Viet Cong members and who were not. Now, the problem with these tactics that we used was that they're turning the loyalty of the South Vietnamese away from us. And we need their loyalty. We need them to tell us where the enemy is and work with us in defeating the enemy. However, in this entire scenario, they are seeing the United States raiding villages and destroying jungles, and they're turning their backs on the United States. So we're struggling. So again, the Viet Cong is an elusive enemy. This next slide deals with the war losing support. So Americans over time are slowly beginning to start to lose support for the war. There are three things that people believed, and I'm going to quote these different beliefs. Number one, people would say that Vietnam was a civil war and the United States had no business being there. The second thing people believed, they would say that South Vietnam was no better than the Communist North. And we did see some oppression through No Dien Diem's government in South Vietnam. The third statement was that the war was draining American strength. So again, there were people in the United States that began turning away from this war and opposing the war. Okay? Those were nicknamed doves. You had doves and hawks. If you supported the war, you were termed a hawk. If you opposed the war and you wanted peace and to get out of the war, you were called a dove during this time. Now, on the screen, a couple of documents. The one on the left shows you that over time, the confidence in the military is decreasing. And the purple line, if you look on the screen with me, the purple line, the confidence in military leaders is going down. So we're thinking the war is a mistake over time, and we're losing confidence in our military over time as well. If you'll look at this document, the one on the right side of the screen, you can see as well that President Johnson has a tiger by the tail. Now, this is an old saying that people would say, I've got a tiger by the tail. And although this isn't perfectly accurate, I wouldn't advise you go and try this, but in theory, if you grab a tiger by the tail, then he can't come around and attack you. And as long as you have him by the tail, you're safe. You can go around in circles and he's not going to get you. Again, I don't think this is perfectly accurate, but it's how the old saying would go. And you want to get out of that situation. You don't want to have the tiger by the tail. You don't want to be near the tiger, but that's where you are. And as long as you're holding on to it, you're safe. So you want out, but you can't let go. So do you see this in this cartoon? How President Johnson has the tiger by the tail. The tiger is Vietnam. He might want out of Vietnam at this time, but he can't just let go or it could harm him. See, we wanted to win. We wanted to be successful. If we just left Vietnam, the North invades the South, and all of that loss of life and all that we worked for in Vietnam would be lost. And you can see as well that it takes place in outer space, so the Vietnam War has taken President Johnson further than he ever wanted to go. Johnson also loses popularity. You can see that at the beginning of his presidential administration, he's at approval rating above 70%. By the end, we see him at the lowest point at 35%, possibly up to 40% approval rating. All during this war, you see his approval rating going down. Also politically, the Democratic Party begins to divide and split during this time on the issue of the war. Half are supporting getting out of the war and opposing Johnson's, what they would call Johnson's war, and the other half want to follow Johnson and want to finish the war well and still end it, but finish the war well. Now, on the board, you can see with me that there are 4 Democratic candidates that entered the race for the 1968 presidential election. And if you know in American politics, you're going to have the primaries before you have the national election. So this is the primary. This is whenever we're deciding that who's going to be the Democratic nominee. Well, President Johnson originally is on the ticket, but he decides to drop out of the race. And he says why here. He says, with America's sons in the field far away, with America's future under challenge right here at home, with our hopes and the world's hopes for peace in the balance every day, I do not believe that I should devote an hour or a day of my time to any personal partisan causes or to any duties other than the awesome duties of this office, the presidency of our country. Accordingly, I shall not seek and will not accept the nomination of my party for another term as president. So in other words, he's saying he has too many important things to do to worry about campaigning for presidency, so he drops out. The brother of President Kennedy, John F. Kennedy, decides to run. His name is Robert Kennedy. His picture's on the screen, and he was assassinated while he was running for president. So that leaves us with 2 candidates for the presidency. At the bottom left, you can see Humphrey and McCarthy. Humphrey is Johnson's vice president, and he represents everything Johnson stood for. McCarthy is the Democratic candidate running on an anti-war platform. So the Democratic Party in their primary election was deciding between Humphrey and McCarthy. But all of this is really going to come to a head in the Democratic National Convention in 1968 in Chicago. And at this convention, the party would decide on who would be the presidential nominee. They decided on Humphrey to be the nominee for the Democratic Party. When that took place, riots broke out in Chicago. There were many anti-war demonstrators in Chicago. The police were called in, and they were armed, and they were instructed to use force to calm the crowd and get everything under control. So what ensued was a war in Chicago between police and protesters. It was a war in the streets, and it was televised for the entire nation to see. Now, the election of 1968, I have a map that I want to show you. If you'll turn your attention to the board, you will see that our 3 major candidates are Richard Nixon, Humphrey, and George Wallace. Now, George Wallace was a candidate from Alabama. He was Alabama governor at one time, and he represented a Democratic party. It's like a third-party candidate, but he represented those who were not satisfied with the desegregation policies of the Democratic Party. So he ran as a third-party candidate, and he took some Democratic votes away from Humphrey in this election. You also had Richard Nixon running as a Republican. Now, the last Republican we had seen was Dwight D. Eisenhower. We've had Kennedy and Johnson during most of the 60s. So this is 1968. Nixon promised 2 things: to restore law and order and to get the United States out of Vietnam. The result of the election is shown on the screen. The electoral vote, remember, is what's going to decide the election. Richard Nixon wins. He gets 301 electoral votes, 51% of those votes. I could ask the question, well, what if George Wallace had not ran for presidency? Because he did pretty good as a third-party candidate. He took Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Arkansas, and Louisiana. All of those electoral votes would have probably went to Humphrey. But even then, as we add those up, it's still leaning toward Richard Nixon. So the question is then, is Johnson and is the Democratic Party blamed for the Vietnam War? And there was a lot of turmoil and there was a lot of questions about that in the 1960s, because remember, I want you to get this, that there was a divide in that party during that time. Now, as we move forward, there was war protests that took place in the country. There were riots, college protests. In fact, at Kent State University, you saw that there were students that were killed by police on campus during a protest. Violence will erupt throughout the nation protesting the war. President Nixon as well, in promising law and order and in promising withdrawing from Vietnam, begins that policy. That's called Vietnamization. We're gradually getting out of the war, but still attempting to achieve our objectives and contain communism. Even in Vietnamization, that doesn't mean we fully withdraw. We still invade Cambodia, and this is him explaining this in this picture, to be able to fight the Viet Cong better from a neutral country. which caused a lot of protest as well. But still, Vietnamization gradually gets us out. Eventually, the United States will remove all troops by the early 1970s. There will be a ceasefire. Ho Chi Minh will promise to stay in the north and allow the democratic state of South Vietnam to remain. But you will find not long after that ceasefire that the north invades the south. President Ford at that time had the ability to go back and fight in Vietnam again, but he decided not to, seeing it as Vietnam War Part 2, which could have lasted just as long and caused just as much loss of life. So we decided not to go back into Vietnam. Also in the United States, I'm going to quickly go through these. You had social movements. The Latino Americans pushed for equality, specifically Mexican Americans in the Southwest, working on farms, they were paid very little. You had job inequality, worked long hours. Cesar Chavez called on Mexican Americans in the United States to unionize and come together and push for equality. You see on the board the poster of the lettuce and grapes boycott, where he's using that as leverage to try in the nation to get these farmers to treat their employees better. Also, you had the feminist movement, which is pushing, feminism is the belief that women should have equal economic, political, and social equality to men. Many women are receiving job inequality, also pay inequality. Employers are paying men more than women for the exact same job. They push for the Equal Rights Amendment in the United States. Supporters believe that this would guarantee women and men would receive the exact same rights and protections under the law. Opponents believe that it would lead to drafting of women and husbands losing the responsibility to provide for their families, and even same-sex marriages is what opponents believed would happen. You can see on the map that in the South, many southern states did not accept that. The counterculture movement, as quickly as I can go, counterculture movement is also known as the hippie movement. There was a lot of drug use. There was a lot of listening to rock and roll and dropping out of society, protesting the war, protesting government and society, sensationalism. Conservatives at times critiqued the counterculture movement and hippies in the United States, saying that they're deteriorating American morals and values, and they are arguing that they're abandoning rational thought for sensationalism. Now, lastly, very quickly, I want to go to this final question that I promised you that we would do. The question is this, and again, if you'll email your answer to mcpsstv@mcpss.com, you'll be entered to win the prizes. Your question is, what term describes American foreign policy during the Cold War? A hint is that this policy got us involved in Korea and Vietnam to keep communism from spreading. So again, what term describes American foreign policy during the Cold War? The last statement I want to leave you with is we've covered a lot. We've seen the 1960s change America more than ever. We've covered World War II. We've covered civil rights. We've also covered the social conditions of the 50s, 60s, and 70s. So I want to thank you for joining me through American history. I want you to be safe and be well and have a good summer. Thank you.